I just want to welcome you all this morning to this conversation. We are the team at Innocent Classroom, working with schools and districts in the Midwest and also throughout the country. And we've been talking about actually the thing that we want to talk with you today is a conversation we've been having internally for at least the past year. And that is what is the reality of it, the reality of systemic racism and innocence as a response to systemic racism. Even as innocence, if we look at systemic innocence, can it be a replacement? Can it create kind of an alternate, or not so much alternate, but better reality for the kids and families we work so hard to serve? And so we've been having this conversation internally a lot in terms of as we studied our work and become to understand our work, and kind of this heightened awareness, heightened a time where there is a lot of urgency around really dismantling systems of oppression and racist systems. And so what we want to do this morning is have this conversation with you. Julian Conde, who directs and oversees all of our programs and program design and our strategic partnerships with schools and districts, is going to walk you through really Innocent Classroom through the lens of systemic racism as being replaced by systemic innocence. And then we're going to open it up for a panel. As I said, for those who joined early, I'm joined this morning with Julian, Jamie, Iman, and Sammy on the Innocent Classroom team. So once Julian talks for a little bit this morning, we'll open it up for a panel conversation. So as you are listening to Julian, don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. Both Sammy and I will be monitoring those. And when we get to the panel portion at about the bottom of the hour, we'll open it up and start answering this question. So Julian, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. This is really, really exciting for me. Exciting to have so many people around the country and even around the world. I didn't know we had a Canadian as well. This is really exciting to come and have this vital conversation. As Matt said, we as a nation and as a world have been really having this heightened focus on what we mean by systemic racism. We're all in this place of whether it's something that we've been working on our whole lives for many of us, or maybe it's something that we are now in this space of ready to have the conversation, ready to begin the conversation. And it's all really exciting to us and so vital to us. And you'll learn really quickly that our approach to these conversations is the same approach that we've had for close to a decade, that we've been doing our work, working with schools, working with educators. But I want to help demonstrate how that process has always been about replacing systemic racism, dismantling racism as exists in our classroom spaces, as it relates in our educational spaces, and ultimately getting to this place where our children are free of the impacts of it. So we start at this really specific spot where it's our commitment to the world that we are engaged with, the commitment that we make to anyone who is willing to listen for a couple of seconds, but ultimately anyone that we partner with in our spaces and through our partnerships. It's this commitment that every single child deserves to feel innocent. Innocent as we describe it and as we define it in our work, this freedom from the negative influences of racialized stereotypes, racialized narratives, racialized expectations, ultimately a freedom from the impacts of systemic racism. Every single child deserves to be free of that. And you'll see that we really get into the narratives that are associated with systemic racism as it's what is created from the systems of oppression, the systems of power of oppression that are everywhere, that we all move through, that we have to go to work in, that our children have to go to school in, that our families are trying to raise their children in. The impacts of that and what comes from those systems are these narratives that keep trying to define us and redefine us and tell us who's who and who's what. That is an experience that is the opposite of innocence. So we get to this place and belief that every single child and family needs to experience education free from that. So that's how we start to think about our commitments to all of our spaces and places to begin to dismantle this thing. And really, it is about relationships. It has to be educator-centered and child-specific. So we start from this really specific space of every single Innocent Classroom has to have a commitment of individual educators willing to understand who the children are in front of them, to build authentic connections, relationships that begin to do that dismantling, relationships that are free from those narratives in our spaces with them. So I want to kind of break down a little bit more how we see this as both a response and how we can even begin to model that response. So it can become systematized. So it can be a system of innocence. So we do believe that there is an answer to the serious and in some cases life-limiting and life-threatening problems that we're confronting in American public education and North American public education. And the answer is the restoration and maintenance of innocence in our marginalized kids. We mean the restoration of an experience that's free from a narrative that was defined before you ever met the students that come to your space. We're talking about an educational space that's free from a narrative that says what it means to be Black, what it means to be Latinx, what it means to be Indigenous. A narrative-free experience for individual children is the response to a racialized system, a racist system. So to really kind of dig into what we mean by guilt and how we want to get to this place of innocence, we start with this question. And we're not going to answer it as a group right now, but some folks who have been through some innocent classroom conversations know this is a question that we do answer in detail. We ask every single group that we've ever worked with, what does our society tell us about children of color? And we can probably pretty quickly think of some of those words that pop in our heads. We can think pretty quickly what we mean by this narrative. What is defining our students? What is defining our families in certain communities? What is defining the work that you all are being asked to do every day in your classrooms, most of you? That narrative that comes from this simple question is what we mean by guilt. That narrative and its impact on you as an educator and the impact of our children. They move through the world wondering if you know them or have the ability to know them, or if you just see them as the answer to this question. Now, I'm about to actually show you a real life answer, a real life list that we generated from this question. And I always like to give a warning before I show this list because it's ugly, it's nasty, but it's super important that we get specific for a moment. When we talk about the impacts of systemic racism, that narrative that's generated from that, this is what we mean. This is what society tells us about children of color. Whether it's that they're loud, that they are only getting certain places and spaces because of affirmative action, that they're entitled, that they only speak certain ways, that they're gangbangers, that they're terrorists, that they're defiant, they're all the stuff. And we also know that this list could be twice as long, 3 times as long, 4 times as long. We could keep going and going and going. And there's also probably some stuff on here that doesn't sound so bad. Things like being athletic. I actually don't know if athletics on this particular one, but things like that end up on these lists often too. Like good at sports, musical. None of that is good when it's embedded on a list like this because we know stereotypes attempt to essentialize us as humans. And the stereotypes will always fail us if that's what they're trying to do. We are unique individuals and our children are unique individuals, but until we demonstrate our belief in that, they wonder if this is what we see. So this is how we think about the impact of systemic racism. Our kids drag its individual impact into your classroom, wondering if you see them in all of these ways. So the only response then is to make sure we take that out of their experience with them, one child at a time. So I kind of want to show, and this is an image that we use to kind of demonstrate how this stuff plays out. This is at times what we see. And we could probably all kind of agree. It's what the behaviors start to look like to us, what the behaviors start to tell us at times if we're not careful, that our kids are silent, that they're angry, that they're apathetic, that they're sullen, that they're unemotional, or they're overly emotional, they're unresponsive, or they're overly responsive. These are the things that we start to see. These are the behaviors that are generated from this narrative. This is that same narrative that comes from that same question of what does our society tell us about children of color? Research on stereotype threat and stereotype consciousness tells us when these narratives exist, it ends up impacting behaviors that start to look these ways. If you believe the whole world sees you like this, and you're entering in a classroom, it might be pretty easy to show up these ways. Or it might be pretty easy for an educator to think that this is how you're showing up if we're not careful. Because this stuff is impacting the way we communicate and engage and build relationships and understand who our kids are. All that's happening all the time. But underneath that is a humanity, the humanity of an individual child. This center ring, this is what we call the good, that for which all else is done in our work. We won't spend too much time talking about it in the detail of the day that we have together, but know that this really truly is our key to our work. This is our practice. We help individual educators understand that in the core of a child's humanity, they're asking for a good, to be cared for, to have a sense of belonging, to feel safe. One of these things is what their humanity is begging for from others. But if we're not careful, the way that they start to think that they can even get their cared for met is by looking like this, behaving in these ways. The patterns start to tell us that the only way that your humanity can live in certain spaces is by just succumbing to these narratives. But underneath it and how we think about this approach is we need to understand that the humanity is there, and we can start to give a new experience that centers that, and that takes away those narratives in our relationships, one child at a time. So I wanted to quickly talk about that individual child relationship process that we talk about with teacher to student. But we all know that that's one person, one child, hopefully multiple children, because educators do this with a lot of kids all the time. But we also know that one person doing one thing one time is not systemic change. We need to be really clear about that. So when we partner with spaces, how we turn this into a systemic response is our ability to make sure that we can impact patterns that allow for that process to happen over and over and over for as many kids as possible. So we can start with that commitment of every single child deserves to have that experience of innocence. Then we can demonstrate how one teacher does that for one child at a time. And then we have to build out patterns in a space that allows that to happen over and over. So we think about these as our patterns of transformation, how we know transformation of actions and beliefs all change and all need to change in hand with each other. When you go into a space, or we're talking about an environment that has many individuals all committed to many other individuals, the only way to impact those unique spaces is if we start to think about the patterns that exist in those spaces that are not making innocence possible, or that are making it more difficult to give this experience for our students and kids. So we have to impact how we think about our kids, that unconscious thought patterns that influence our perceptions and the ways of being. We have to really start to think about how we think. But then we also have to change how we move, our practices that exist every day. How do we plan to do this for our kids? How do we move differently that demonstrates our thinking differently? And then how do we collaborate around that? The patterns of collaboration become really essential. We know that we have folks in our schools, probably many of you guys are embedded in your spaces as sometimes the one carrying the torch for this humanities stuff. But we need to make sure that you have the tools to collaborate with others and help them understand what it is that you're trying to do for kids. So our ability to intentionally communicate our transformations with colleagues, with others in our spaces. And then we really think about patterns of leadership, how essential it is that whatever the leaders are in a space, it's not just a title leader, but the ones who are willing to lead the thinking in a culture. How do we help you lead in a way that keeps innocence front and center, that allows innocence to be the priority? And then finally, we get to this place of applications where the actual applications that exist within a system, whether it's the referral worksheets that we use, or the different intake processes, or the protocols around behavior, all of those things, those have to start to be integrated and changed as necessary based on what we know about innocence in our environments. But we can't jump there. We can't just say, let's change your referral system now, let's change your demerit system now, until we've changed how we think and practice, because then that will reveal to us what needs to be changed in our systems. So we like to talk about all of these patterns all in hand together to get to a space of transformation for innocence. This is how we begin to think about it, one relationship at a time, and then building out that one relationship at a time systemically that serves the experience of all children, particularly our Black and Brown and Indigenous children in our spaces who over and over are being told that they're not for them. Our classrooms are not for them because that's what that narrative keeps saying. So we have to plan and build an intentional process that says that's not who we are. And then we have to do it over and over and over. So really engaging one child's individual good makes an authentic relationship possible. And those relationships are the pathway to this experience of innocence. So we, in our work and all of our partnerships, we think about that one educator at a time, and we try to really expand that over and over and over, and ultimately get to this place where a space is hanging on to it on their own. It has to be an ownership thing where it's how do we reproduce this concept, these relationships and these practices and these patterns in our spaces so we can do this for kids that are not with us yet, kids that are coming to us next year and the year after and the year after that. So this is really how, and I know this is really fast, but we are going to allow a lot of time to really dig into all the details of what we're talking about. I'm really excited to invite in the rest of my programs team so you don't have to just listen to me talk about this stuff. And I also know that there's people right here in our audience who can really speak to how some of this plays out in their own environments, in their own spaces. So I'm super excited for us to kind of expand this conversation out a little bit and dig into any of the places that kind of questions are popping up. If you're kind of wondering like, well, what does that really mean? Or how does that really play out? We're really excited to dig into any of those details that you all kind of need or want. So Matt, I'll invite you to come back in, but also if you all have questions that start generating and you haven't yet, and it looks like Jamie already asked, feel free to throw them into the chat now. But yeah, the rest of us are gonna kind of come in and start talking.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And thanks for those who put some questions in the chat. Continue to do that. I mean, so one thing, and Julian, I think I'll ask this first question of you. When you think of, I mean, we know what a school system, unfortunately, looks like that's based in systemic racism, right? Like where you've got, so this is more of an idea question or picture question, image question. You know, we've got all these, we don't need to detail our current system and its failings. But if you think, when you think about, or when we think about a system based on innocence, in which innocence is systemic, not racist, it's systemic. What do you see? What do we see? You know, kind of beyond that commitment side, what does that begin to look like for you when you start to partner with the school or a district?
Yeah, I mean, so what does the commitment towards innocence begin to look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess my question is thinking about the child. Like we know what a child has to navigate now with these crap narratives about them, their families, their neighborhoods, the way they're seen or they perceive they're being seen by the teacher. So I guess make it more precise. How does a child navigate an innocent system? What begins to change for that specific child as we that does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's right on. And it's what we know about all of the things we're talking about is how unique it is to every single individual. But what's true is innocence equals a higher amount of belief in the spaces that are here to serve us, the spaces that we're there to navigate. So when innocence exists in a classroom, an innocent child can believe that they can try hard in that classroom. They believe that they can have a hard day, but they know that they're not going to be condemned for their racialized narratives. They know that they get to be seen for who they really are and learn the way they need to learn, build relationships the way they need to build relationships, but always be seen for their humanity. So and I know that doesn't sound very specific because every single child's experience of that is special and unique to who they are. So my innocent experience in the classroom space is special and unique to my experience of the guilt that was stopping me to feel innocent in that space. So the ways that we free up individual children to experience our classrooms differently, one of the blanket statements I can make is that child will believe in all the other things that you're there to do. Whether you're there to teach a math, to teach language, or to build a relationship, they will believe that your intentions are pure and for them, and instead of something that was actually there to define them as the other. Because unfortunately, sometimes the way our classrooms operate and sometimes our expectations, classroom rules and operations, all of that, some of our kids, especially our Black children, they hear all of that as you telling them exactly how they don't belong in your space. Until we demonstrate that, no, my expectations are specifically for you too. So that's what we really start to see as innocence, this belief that our expectations are for them. When we start to say stuff like every single child can be college and career ready, it falls on deaf ears if we're not being really specific on who that child is, who that child needs, or how that child needs to hear what you're trying to say to them. So it needs to be really, it's belief.
Thank you. So beautiful. I mean, that's the right. Innocence is this thing we can't imagine for so many of our kids. And so one thing, I mean, this is a question for Jamie. When you work, when we begin our strategic partnerships or sitting down with the school, how do we enter into that space to start planning the project, the partnership, to help those principals, those teachers, those educators in the space to start to believe that even though systemic racism is this heavy of pervasive reality for so many of our kids, that this space can be different. This place can be different. Maybe this classroom, then this hallway, then this school. So just how do we do that? How do you do that as you start to build your partnerships and the relationships with our schools and districts?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thanks, Julian. Hey, everybody, Jamie, Assistant Vice President and Trainer with Innocent Classroom. And, 15 years ago when I got into education, I started as a para and I became a teacher, and I went to nonprofit space, and I trained teachers, and I went to the HR space, and I did a number of things. And what always, right, was overwhelming or exhausting, or what didn't make sense, was that there was an aggregate solution that could be applied to groups of kids that was thought to work in any space it could walk into, right? And it was like, okay, maybe kind of this could work for some kids, or it was like, oh, damn, we've got this problem and let's get a program and hope it fixes it, right? And so what we've learned in our work is we start with schools and educators the same way we start with an educator with an individual child, is do we know them well enough to understand what that journey is for that child, as Julian just spoke about, for an individual child. So we do that in partnership with schools, because even within the same district, two schools are on a different journey towards this concept of systemic innocence. And so from the very beginning, we sit down and get to know you. We talk about these patterns. We talk about what's showing up. We help see like what might be going on with our educators, like willingness to change. I get it, right? Threshold for change in education can be hard. Well, in all spaces, right? And particularly this last year, dang, right? It was just like change after change after change. So our whole purpose in partnership is that we have a methodology, we have a way of getting through it that works directly with you. So we get to know you. We plan our sessions with you. We help you identify who can kind of be the movement with you. We think about what other things are you doing that might intersect or challenge this notion, right? What is the current mindset? Carrie, thanks for that, right? What is the current mindset of educators in your system? What is that tied up in? What might we be able to identify? So as we think about patterns, it isn't necessarily leaving patterns behind, it's just replacing them, right? We're all stuck in patterns, every single one of us, patterns of thinking, patterns of practice, patterns of how we collaborate, right? That are tied up in trust, that are tied up in belief. And so we can't just stop doing those patterns, because we'd be left with nothing, right? Or we're left in systems of panic. For those of you who have ever been in a system that suddenly went to like no suspensions, it gave teachers no other skills, right? And we were left in systems of panic because we didn't know how to replace the patterns of responding to behaviors that we have, right? And so how do we immediately start to replace patterns? And so we always start individual children, individual teachers, right? Julian spoke beautifully to that. The more that we come into the powerful duality in these relationships with our children and with one another, it starts to pivot our thinking about the other things we're doing, right? Starts to pivot our thinking about our referral forms, about our behavior management, right? About our how we communicate with parents, about recruiting parents, like all of the things that we often focus on, thinking if we change those, somehow magically the experience is going to change for our parents, right? But to Julian's point, it's about belief, right? If you create something within a system that I never believed was for me to start with, creating a thing that's supposed to work for everybody was never actually created for me or with me. Relationships have to be the starting point when we think about interrupting racism in our schools, right? Dismantling systemic racism, because the person to person, right? Julian laid out powerfully the influence and impact of this narrative. It isn't one that can be responded to by saying a group of people must experience this thing the same way, so let's do a big thing on this end. So let's pump the brakes, right? Let's back up. figure out what's happening, right? Figure out, go straight at the most important tool we have as educators, which is relationship, right? The most important tool we have as educators is relationship to help a child, a family, a community believe in all of the other things that we think should be working. And two things can happen there. One, we find out they are good and should be working, but we didn't help a child or family believe in it. Or we find out there's good reason why they don't believe in the thing we're doing because it has nothing to do with them, right? No matter how good we are at other things. And so I worked for many years with really brilliant, really passionate, really dedicated, really natural teachers who were great at relationships here and there. But systemic innocence isn't about the thing we're asking our children to come to. It's about 100% of the time feeling free to be who they are, knowing they will never be responded to through stereotyped expectations or stereotyped narratives, whether it be in one-off responses, whether it be in how we refer them to special education programs, whether it be in how we manage our classrooms, whether it be in how we reward, discipline, demerit, whatever those things might be, that every single moment through this relationship is created for you. And so all of that long to say what that means at a city's middle school or two different elementary schools is going to be different because the humans there are different. And so we get to know you, plan that out, vision with you, check in. We constantly in this space of like, what's working, what isn't working, what do you need, providing leadership coaching, because it can't be reliant on us as a company, right? It is reliant on helping you all have the skills to see it, know it, provide feedback, have people who keep it going, systems that support it, right? When you think about all the systems, belief leads to practice, leads to collaboration. All of those three things happen at the same time to the person who asked the patterns question. And then we can pivot and think about policies, procedures, and practices. So we can see them through a lens of shared innocence through collaboration and leadership. So hopefully that answers the question, man.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jamie. I mean, one of the things I just a comment that is most exciting to be part of conversations with schools when, and this is a shifting of the way you look at school. And you said it towards the end, it's not about doing something that's building a system for children. It's actually looking at that system ultimately when it's in a classroom through the child's eyes, right? Understanding when you do that, you begin to see all the narratives that system has about that child. And then you begin to transform to create an innocent space for that child. Those are really exciting conversations when educators and schools begin to realize, oh, I have to shift. This isn't just a small thing. This is actually creating, we talk child specific, right? But this is building innocence for each individual child. And it dramatically changes. That change almost seems, I mean, when that change happens, all the patterns of application, the patterns of leadership begin to naturally shift because the perspective is rooted in the child's experience of our system, not in the system's experience of the child, so to speak. But I want to introduce Sammy. Sammy's been monitoring the chat.
So everybody, all the bus drivers tell me they look first places.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sammy, Assistant Director of Programs and a trainer with Innocent Classroom. I'm seeing some really incredible questions here in the chat, and a lot of them are speaking to Jamie and Julian, what you just beautifully covered about how we think about approaching the patterns that lie at the center of all of our schools and our systems. And I want to combine a little bit Sarah's question with Carrie's question, which is, do we transform all of these patterns simultaneously? And Carrie asks, what are some good first steps for transforming mindset? So as we think about starting a partnership with a new school or a new district, how do we start transforming these patterns? What comes first?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jamie beautifully was like trying to answer like multiple questions in her response, but towards the end, she kind of said, with the patterns, we always, no matter where we go into a space, right away, right off the bat, we're going to impact patterns of thinking, patterns of practice, and patterns of collaboration. Those three are always hand in hand. We're not gonna sit and just be a program that's gonna teach you all about the histories of race and histories of racism, and then that's it. Because that would be a pattern of thinking that could help. It's like, yeah, great, I can see the world a little bit differently. And we immediately want you to start to think about the children in front of you who are experiencing that stuff that we just talked about. So right away, you're given really specific actionable items that relate to specific children in your space. So right away, the thinking and the practice go together. And then the collaboration around that, where part of the practice is discuss this practice with your colleagues, come up with, share what you see about that child, share what you know about that child, and collectively come up with a new way of approaching that child so you can continue to demonstrate your commitment to that experience of innocence for them. So those three things, those first three patterns, if there is an order, those are the ones that kind of have to happen all the time. And then to Matt's point, to Jamie's point, the leadership component has to happen. And sometimes it happens very naturally where it's like, okay, I get what you're asking my people to do or what you're trying to make happen in this space. Let me help build the runway that allows this to keep happening with less issue, less problems, less obstacles. And some of that same conversation also reveals those elements of application that might be getting in the way of this practice as well. So if right away you're trying to build an individualized practice that helps children see you seeing them differently, you might have to call into question certain policies that happen in your space because they keep getting in the way of what you're being asked to do. So we've seen sometimes where it's like, if you're in one of those classrooms, and I do not want to condemn anyone's classroom styles, but if you're writing a kid's name on the board over and over whenever they're doing something bad, and you just learn how you can you're feeding guilt over and over when you do something like that, maybe you might decide to stop doing that the next day. You might decide to start changing some of your applications immediately because you're like, whoa, I need to figure out how I can make this less guilty or less impactful on the child's humanity, because what I was doing, my intention was to do the opposite. My intention, and I have to assume our intentions in our classrooms are to teach kids and to care for kids. But sometimes the things that we do after having a really specific conversation around innocence and goodness and guilt, you might reveal some of those intentions that you had are landing squarely wrong on some of our kids. So I say that to say that maybe early on you start to reflect on applications and you want help with that, or you're starting to wonder what needs to change immediately. Those things happen pretty naturally and organically, but they also happen in partnership with us as we build our practice. So that I would say is the if there is an order, but it is so case specific and space specific. Sam, was there a second question in what you said that I didn't answer?
No, I think you covered it. I think Carrie was asking about good first steps. And I think your point about starting with the child-specific relationship that lends itself to innocence is that exact question.
Yeah. And the good first steps too, even like, I'm wondering if part of that is like, as someone who's sitting in this space today, it's like, maybe you've heard about us just from as much as we just talked about it. It's like, I want to make sure innocence is in my space tomorrow. Like, so like, you might already be thinking like, that's like, what are my first steps as it relates to that? I would, and we always kind of say this before we get started with the schools or place, it's like, think about how much relationships are prioritized in your space. Or like, you can already start to think about that. Like, are relationships prioritizing how much time you have in your classroom day, how much time is spent dedicated to relationships in your whole environment, all of those things, whether or not you have power to change it immediately, the reflection on it, and like, because you will know pretty immediately over and over, you have to prioritize individual relationships. So a good place to start is to just think about what's in the way of our prioritization of relationships, what's in the way of, or what's right now communicating guilt to some of our students. And some of that stuff might come up really early on, but also it's just this willingness to take relationships as seriously as we all kind of know they are, I'd say is a really powerful first step as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think speaking to that question of the narratives that impact our spaces, Heather asks a really good question too. She makes the point, once we get all staff on board with transforming the classroom experience, we need to extend these new narratives outside the classroom to the hallways and our online platforms that our students live in. So she asks, how do we also transform student perspectives to that of innocence?
Yeah, good question. Iman, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot, how much control we have as educators with everything that happens outside of our classroom. And some of the things that we, tell people that we're training, educators that we're training all the time, is that you really do have control over the space, over the time that the children are with you. And a lot of times, and we realized that Shelina and I talked about it even during a happy hour when you came, what happens to our kids outside of outside of our space can sometimes create a huge innocence deficit, and then they come back to us. And we know, I mean, we even talked about it, Shalina, with Minneapolis. All of our babies were, for the past couple of weeks, taking in a lot of narratives about them, and that guilt level was rising for a lot of them because kids are brilliant. They know exactly what is being said and the narratives that are out there, and especially really trying times for different cities. And so all we can do as educators is be aware of that and then fill up their tank again, really engage the humanity. And the only way that we can do that is by doing that ex ante work of really understanding who they are and engaging the good that we have identified because we've done that prior work. So it's sometimes really hard for us to understand or know that we have very little control outside of that space. But what we do have power over is it during the time that they're with us, to allow them to become whole again so that they can receive the information and all the curriculum that you all have so beautifully designed for them. So it is sometimes having to give up and understand that you can't do much about it, but also knowing you do have power because they're with you for a really long time of their day usually. And during that time, especially in the hallways, if we have created a culture of innocence, then we can imagine children going from classroom to classroom experiencing that same wholeness, because a whole school or a whole district committed to that culture, to that understanding of what innocence can mean and does mean for our children. So Heather, it's a brilliant question. It's one that constantly comes up both when we're training and even during happy hours where educators come and we have these conversations. But the answer that I would constantly stick to is doing exactly what so many of our trained educators do: understand that reality and come in already with a plan Monday morning of figuring out what can I do for my kids while they're with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's right on. That's the response. And I know oftentimes that question comes from just like a deep care. It's like, I care so much about our kids. I'm doing this really excellent, meaningful thing for them in my space. And then I keep worrying. I keep thinking about them. They leave my room and I know the next teacher might not be thinking this way. Someone in the hall might not be thinking this way. We know their trip home might not be treating them this way. We know what's happening at home might not be treated. All of that happens. And we all know how impactful one relationship with one adult who really sees you can be. And it's not enough, but sometimes it's all we can have, and it can take us so far. So I only say that to say to just like to always advocate for all that we can do in the little bit of space and time that we have can change lives. Even if you're the only one and it was only one time and then you don't ever get to see that child again, it can carry that child really far places. And I can speak from my own experiences of how these individual educators have made these deep connections with me to carry me for a while. And then you miss those relationships in between at times, and you navigate the world and you try to find your innocence in these other ways. And it's hard, and we care so much about our kids for the right reasons. And I just say all that to say that the imperative to keep it going is just that much more meaningful because of that exact question, knowing that the world is maybe going to do the opposite. I really appreciate that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And to build on that too, I think we can pivot a little bit to Amber's question of knowing that the world is going to try to do the opposite, right? Sometimes these really, really loud movements or moments happen to try to hold on to that ugly narrative and center it in our spaces. And Amber asks, what do we do if white students are going home, talking with their parents, or getting mad that we as a school are teaching another narrative? So speaking sort of to the blowback that can happen when we start to center a narrative of innocence, how do we as educators respond?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question when we think about the work we do, because Julian says over and over, and he might, right, what we're teaching about is centering humanity, individual humanity, who a child is, right? Our program isn't about posters and checklists and saying innocence exists here and this is what it means. It's about creating an environment in which innocence becomes the lived experience for everyone, right? And yeah, sure, absolutely. White kids, right? White parents get wind of the fact that money's being invested in a program that prioritizes certain kids. Okay, right? I don't know what to tell you other than, okay, If we're going to create anti-racist systems, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen. And we're going to continue to center humanity because there's kids in front of us, right? Who know that we'll buckle under that conversation, who know that that white parent anger will make us be like, okay, whoa, back up then, right? But innocence isn't about a program. It's not an initiative, right? It's not a thing that we're asking you to do this year and then the world is free of racism. It's about a commitment to changing our relationships with individual children that will change relationships with children with one another, that changes parents' relationship with us, that changes, right? Even some of the parents who might be like, all right, why are you doing this thing about race? You're alienating my child. It's like, I'm doing the same thing for these Black and brown and indigenous children that I've been doing for your child always, which is see their humanity. That's all. I still see your kids' humanity. I didn't take anything from them, right? I still know your child. I can tell you that for which all else they do, I can find their good, and I can find Iman's good, and I can find Julian's good, because this is about an individual child, right? This is about a relationship. This is about those number of things. And so what is interesting in our history is it's never become a contentious issue, because we're not sitting around having a conversation about race, right? We're not indicting anyone. In fact, we all can unite around the one thing we care most about in these spaces, which is children, right? That's it. An individual child getting to be fully themselves. And in that practice too, it changes, and Iman and Julian highlighted this really well too, is like how we hear those white parents starts to change too, right? Is that anger is fear. That anger is a concern. That anger is not, right? And when we're in a practice of innocence, we start to see resistance different. We start to see all of these things in a way where we turn and we go, okay, we got this, right? We know how to respond to this through a relationship, right? Because innocence is not an intellectual exercise, right? Innocence is a human to human exercise, right? That interrupts the patterns of thinking, the patterns of ways we've existed in a space that say, hey, right, that this is the work that we're doing for individual kids. And I think when you do it over and over, yeah, I hope that people start to say this feels a little bit different, right? I hope this school feels a little bit more as though everybody can be involved, and right, in partnership with us. It's also something that we can help navigate if there's that sort of anger around innocence existing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have very specific examples that I want to go too deep into because they are so personal to the spaces where, but we were brought in for partnership conversations to discuss this very question of like white families, not talking about innocent classroom, but talking about just new curriculum in a space because it's serving our Black students and the pushback that starts to bubble up. But in that conversation, we know that it's not about innocent classroom, it's about something else. But innocent classroom and our response in this concept of innocence is still the response that these white families are looking for and our Black families are looking for. And it's not to say that like we prioritize one or the other, but we are doing is making sure that everyone has this experience of innocence. And that is why some of these questions even come up of like, what are you doing in our schools? Or what's happening to my child, or all that stuff. But I don't actually want to talk about that. I want to talk about Keith's question, or statement more, to transform our students. I think staff has to buy into this practice, what they practice, what they preach, and it would be difficult to convince me as a student that I'm innocent when I smell stereotype, threat, and pro-guilt all over my teacher. Absolutely. And I want to just like make sure that we're super clear about a couple of things. One, innocent classroom never asks you to transform your students. Not once. And it's not about our kids needing to be transformed. It's about educators transforming how they see their kids and experience their kids and engage with their kids. And in doing so, we'll see new sides of our students, new parts of our kids, and maybe even they'll transform how they're experiencing our classrooms. But the point is that their whole humanity has always been tied up in all of that. We help educators experience these individuals differently so they can demonstrate their experience differently for those individual kids. And if you do that, that's actually a process that dismantles the response to stereotype threat. So what we're saying is we need to do that work. We don't say, I have an innocent classroom, we're innocent here. If you're saying that before you've done anything new for a Black child or an Indigenous child, you're might just be piling on more narrative guilt, more ideas around. It's the same way that we talk about how our classrooms are safe spaces. For some kids, they have never been a safe space. So we say that and it feels like we're pushing them further away. If you go into your class and say, hey, I went to this really great thing on Thursday morning. Guess what? We're innocent here now. You're going to have a lot of kids look at you like, what the heck are you talking about? But then once you really don't do anything new for them, it's going to, the point will be missed is all I'm getting at. But we need to demonstrate our commitment to innocence, not say it, not even display it. Maybe that happens down the road. Some of our spaces, they get really jazzed about, we are an innocent classroom school, and this is because we've already demonstrated it through these ways. But you can't jump there. It's a covert operation so often where it's, I'm committed to giving this experience of innocence to my Black and brown kids. And I'm doing that over and over and over. And then our kids will look up and realize that they have not had a stereotype threat response to you in a while because they see you seeing them. And that is how the belief can happen. So you're absolutely right that it has to be authentic and it has to be real, because we're working on helping our students see us seeing them. Yeah, so I don't know if there's another question to queue up, but I wanted to jump in with that.
No, that's right on. And I think there's just different things coming up about like where our teachers have pushed back, right? Where discomfort has been around this work. And I'm seeing a few questions and comments around cultural proficiency and culturally responsive teaching, which often is asked too. Well, how does Innocent Classroom fit with that? And I do, right? There's this pivot when we think about culturally responsive teaching, what we're asking teachers to do, which is valid. Think outside their own individual experience of their culture, their race. And there's this limitation because we're asking them to believe that every child experiences their culture, race in the same way, right? And so what happens for teachers is they think, then I have this understanding of groups, right? I've got an understanding of myself and how I fit kind of, and then I've got an understanding of this group over here. And then all of a sudden, I don't know how to be a thing for this whole group of kids. That's different, right? I don't know. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get defensive and tell you, wait, though, my thing is real. How my experience, right? We get caught back, as Julian thought, those narratives, but like, wait a second, this thing is real. In fact, I get caught in old patterns of now my understanding of this culture might actually get caught up in some negative responses, right? Both to the relationships I could have with children or the thing you're asking me to do. Now, the fallacy in leaving it just with culturally responsive teaching is that every single child, they could be neighbors, they could come from the same home, experiences their culture, their rules, their norms, individual to them. And if I, as a white teacher, stand outside with only an aggregate understanding and try and construct something that's closer to, but still not all the way for that child, it's not going to have the outcomes we want. And from a teacher standpoint, then that gets exhausting. You told me this thing would work. If I did this, if I got this training, then all of a sudden, all of my children would show up differently, right? I don't think there's a person in this room where that makes sense, right? If I'm already coming to your room not believing the thing you're doing, and now maybe you've got a more generic, maybe closer, I can see you're trying a little harder, right? But why would I ever believe the thing you're constructing is for me? Now, culturally responsive teaching has lots of great things in it. But what I want to say is like in this space of innocence and saying, do we have a practice within that allows us to reveal for an individual child, I want to know you within the thing that I've learned. I'm not just going to apply the thing I've learned to you. Do I know you well enough to understand how you're experiencing it, your family, your whatever, right? Like what you actually care about, what matters to you, what you're passionate about, what your norms actually mean to you, not because I was over here, right? And I say that only that aggregational understanding is helpful and moves us a lot closer, right? In understanding histories and cultures and neighborhoods and kids in our schools and religions, yes. But it doesn't get us to innocence when we're thinking about a child who doesn't believe that they can ever be understood as anything other than a set of narratives, right? It's a different narrative. It helps us see through some of the guilty narrative, but it doesn't help us understand for an individual child what it is that they need from us to know that our understanding of any narrative is because of how they experience it, right? And how we're willing to be in a relationship with them. So, Sammy, what else are you seeing?
Yeah, folks, we've got some time for a couple more questions. So if you have any pop up, go ahead and throw them in the chat. Until then, I think it'd be helpful to speak a little bit to Marianne's point of saying staff with full support from administrators. Can we talk a little bit about what a supportive administrator for Innocence might look like, or how an administrator might support their staff in this work towards innocence as we work to transform patterns in that space?
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit, but I mean, my quickest quip on it is be in the work with them and be with us a step ahead of them, right? It's like, be in it, be a step ahead, be in it, be a step ahead. Is that there can't be a leadership component and a staff component, right? It's what our kids feel too. There's this thing happening and teachers talk about it over here. And so the most supportive staff is one saying, you're on your own individual journey towards this as well, right? Is like, I got to figure out what this means, how I construct innocence. Can I do this with kids? We help staff, we help leadership and teams do it, administration. We help do that with staff as well, right? So there are some additional components, but it is that willingness to sit both in it and be a step ahead so you can anticipate. And that's the work we do with you, is like, here's what we know in our experience, questions that are probably going to come. Because we've got such an open partnership that you're being honest in what you're hearing. And so we're always like, so what tool or what question is coming so we can help you respond to it in a way that still allows you to both be in it and be the leader that you are, right? Because both are true at the same time. So.
Yeah, I don't have to say much more beyond that, but it's something that we just think about every space we're in, how vital it is that it never is an experience of Innocent Classroom is happening to your staff. It has to be Innocent Classroom is partnering with you and your staff to reach this goal, this vision. And when it becomes like we're in this together, then as admin and leadership, they don't necessarily have all the answers. They're not Innocent Classroom experts, but they do feel more equipped to understand the journey and the process that we are trying to go on and ask the right questions if necessary, or guide their staff to asking the right questions, whatever it might be. So we do try to equip them to like a couple steps ahead so they can anticipate where the questions are going to go. And they also just feel like they're not alone after we leave, like in between those sessions, that's where the work starts to really happen, So it's when the work is happening on a tough day, when one of your staff is trying to see a child's good and their humanity, we want to make sure the admin in that space can guide those conversations best they can, ask for help if necessary. So it's really just giving the space for administration to understand the point of our work and understand the importance of some of the conversations, but then also support the practice when it's happening in live moments. So.
Yeah, I like that, Heather, right? Like the journey isn't about getting it right and getting it wrong, right? It's about having a consistent set of patterns that make sure that when hopefully it doesn't creep in, guilt, right? That we can make sure we found ways that it's not creeping in, but that we also have a shared practice that interrupts it when it does. And I know we didn't spend a lot of time on good, but there's a power in this methodology around good that Julian named, right? Because it can seem really amorphic as a leader too, where it's like, yeah, innocence, and like, oh my God, how much redirection, and how am I going to spot it, and what do I tell the teacher? And there's a methodology both in staff and how you partner with them around good that allows it to always feel like it's always infuses hope into the most messed up, ridiculous, crazy situations between a child and a teacher, right? Because that's the space we're always going to be in it, is can I sit with you, teacher, who's like, I cannot deal with this anymore. Get this kid out of my classroom, blah, blah. And you don't have to be like, but we're focused on innocence and look at it. And we do. It's like, hold on, I'm here with you, right? There's something about this child we need to understand, right? Let's start with good. Let's start with this methodology, right? That's the immediate interruption of systemic racism, is to immediately remove it from that relationship as quickly as you can, right? Because all of our skills, all of our strategies, everything will then shift. And so I know we're talking really big picture and long journey and replace everything. And I want you to know that the work that you all would do around innocence, and I want to say we, but how we partner with you, is that ability to every moment be in it with them in a way that creates hope and partnership, right? And that's always for me been the beauty of what Alex and this team have created, is that it's always been infused with possibility, particularly in the moments where we've lost, right? We felt a little, whether it be virtual learning, right? Where it was like, I don't know, we can't do relationships. It was like, wait, you can. Let's start here, right? Let's start with understanding this methodology around good, because then we can always find a way towards that relationship with the child. And so that I just wanted to make sure that from the like really big, how do we, to the every single moment, there's a way to be in it with your staff. That is really holdable, really practical, and really on the ground. That matters most for us. That impacts kids immediately from the first minute we're with you to whatever minute we're with you later. So,
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for zooming in there and focusing us on that really concrete methodology that is at the center of all of these patterns and all of these replacings. Is this very concrete interruption, replacement of the patterns that allow narratives to control or creep into our relationships with patterns of innocence instead. So thank you. Matt, I do want to flag it is 10:59 Central Time. So I want to turn it over to you to close out the conversation.
Great. So I have thank you so much. Thanks to the team. My internet did something and I was gone, and then I found my way back in. I'm not sure how. I thought I was going to crash the whole meeting because it's on my account. I have put in the chat a form if you want to continue the conversation. There's ways to continue that. I'll be back in this space or a space like this on 2 weeks from today. You can sign up for times if you want to, and you can also sign up for another time. There's a way to do that both ways if you want to continue the conversation. And I want to leave you with, Innocent Classroom works best. We've talked about this, I think, in terms of your beginning thinking about it, to think about one particular child. Think about one kid who you are in or out of relationship with, and begin to think about the narratives that child might have to carry with them. I mean, sometimes when we start this, before we even begin, we're like, pick a kid you're out of relationship with and think about that child while you're going through this hour-long conversation with us. But I'm going to do this at the end and say, think about it, one child. Think about the narratives that child has to deal with, what that child has to navigate within a system of racism, which is supported by these crap narratives about them. And then just begin to think, what could I do for this child? What's their good? What's actually motivating their behavior? Is guilt generating part of this child's behavior? But what's really generating that child's behavior might be simply a desire for connectedness, simply a desire for, can you see me? Nobody ever sees me. The only time somebody sees me is when I'm loud. I get seen. So I'm going to be loud. But they don't want to be seen as loud. What they want to be doing is seen as an individual. So as you're thinking, as you're reflecting, as you're going back to your workday, think about that one child, because that's where the power of the Innocent Classroom, that's where we can stop being systemically racism for that one child. And then hopefully maybe we could have another conversation about, well, what does this look like across my classroom, where all the kids in my classroom, maybe in my school, maybe in my hallways, maybe in my district. So those are my parting thoughts. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for staying over. I hope we have a chance to continue the conversation. Take care, everyone.